Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dave Heckeroth. Welcome to another round of FICO Tech Talk. Today, we're going to be talking about the originations application, and within that, specifically, we're going to be talking about the decision module. Now, in the decision module, we'll take it a layer deeper and talk about the best practices that we use. We'll talk about the life cycle that gets applied to that development configuration process. And most specifically, we'll even drop down to the code review process and how we apply our code review techniques to make the decision module portion of the originations application as good as it can be, to make it faster, to make it of a higher quality, and to make sure that those best practices are being followed in our implementations. So looking at the agenda, we'll talk about best practices and the actual guide, the document that we've deployed, where you can find it. We'll talk about the code reviews that are out there, largely being applied in a manual way. We'll go over a few of those. We'll talk about the concept of automating the code review process and what techniques, what capabilities you have had in the past and those that we're hoping to add today and in the future. Here we see a simple layout of the originations application, and I've highlighted in red the component, which is the decision module piece of the origination application. The decision module is responsible for the decision-making part of Origination Manager. It leverages business rules and decision logic in order to make loan determination type decisions. Those are things like approving an applicant or perhaps declining an applicant, maybe even referring an applicant to underwriting for a deeper review. FICO has a professional services team that help our customers configure Origination Manager in a way that makes sense for their business. We have technical decision module analysts that will go in and assist. We want those analysts to produce the highest quality code possible. Code that's the most efficient, that applies the business logic for our customers, that's easy to maintain for them. And we want our technical people to be able to show that they have followed our best practices as easily as possible. So the first thing is for us to document that. So in that quest, we ask that our technical people follow and apply best practices for decision module. I know that most listening to this have a good understanding of what best practices are, but with the help of our friends at Wikipedia, I offer this as a definition. A best practice is a method or a technique that has generally been accepted as superior. And that's what we're really talking about here. How do we take the best practices that have been identified by the people implementing and developing these origination applications over many, many years and make it available to all of those who want to implement? Now, because we want our DM technical people to follow these best practices when implementing DM for our customers, I thought it'd be a good idea to show you where you could find that. You can find the DM best practices document in Jive, but we all know that sometimes it's hard down to where exactly that document it is. So I've also put it in Microsoft Teams site. You can see that's in the Originations Manager site and in a sub-channel called DM Implementation Best Practices. And if you look in the Files tab in that channel, you'll see the OMDM Best Practices document. Here it's version 1. I believe the current release is actually version 1.1. Now inside the Best Practices document, we have really three major sections. The first of which we've highlighted here, which is the rule harvesting practices, basically the functional design phase. Some examples of best practices in this section would be things like making a rule concise, being able to avoid circular reasoning within your harvesting or your logic processing. Next in the best practices document are two sections, one of which is the performance and coding practices. And you can see where this would have a very close connection. This would have a very close connection to the code review process because these are more implementation specific type practices. Also, in addition to this section is the naming convention practices. That also has a connection to the code review process as well because of the names being used to develop the application also. Let's take a look at a couple of the practices that might fall into each of these sections. Okay, so for the coding and performance section, we have a couple of best practices here. The first one has to do with the item types called data methods. The best practice says, turn off data methods save history in staging and production environments. This is because the data method save history flag is a feature that allows developers to, when it's enabled, to be able to see the input arguments, local variable, output variables, when they go through the consultative process of sending a request to the application and then getting its response. It allows them to see those data values. When the systems have all been tested, of course, you don't want the overhead of that happening in the production or staging environment. So the recommendation here is that we turn that off. The second best practice in this section that we're really highlighting is that we're suggesting that the unused logic or code that's in the application, perhaps it was set up as with the best intention of using it, but for whatever reason it did not get populated with logic or data transformation, whatever the case may be, for the application. So the suggestion is, the best practice says, it's OMDM's best practice to clean up unused code or logic snippets. For maintenance purposes, obviously, it significantly helps in debugging and gives one less thing that the technical analyst has to go through in order to review whether a particular transaction is operating as expected. We're going to see both of these best practices in action in our automated solution a little bit later on in the CART application. So hang tight and you'll see that. And to go along with the naming convention section of the DM best practices, we're going to review these two concepts, and they have to do with variables and input arguments. The best practice is basically data methods with input variable names should begin with an I, and local variable names should begin with an X. And so we want to check for the input variable names and the local variable names and make sure that they start with the appropriate letter. So next, the second part of our talk, I wanted to spend just a minute or two and talk about the DM code review process. But before we jump into that, I want to highlight the fact that I've stolen a couple of things from Seema's talk that she did several months ago, where she talked about the Origination Manager playbook, the decision module lifecycle, and how we go through the development and configuration process for DM. You can see that that's been highlighted here. I've also included in the box folder where you can go to get process and methodology for Origination Manager Playbook. I would encourage you to do that because there's a lot of good information out there in addition to just what I'm highlighting here. You can see that I've highlighted the first 2 through 3 phases of the DMLC, and you can see the types of things that does from a rule harvesting and a functional design type perspective. We're talking about creating the test planning and things of that nature. When we talk about code review, it's these preface sort of materials which really lead into the important execution portion of the life cycle. That actual next phase of the process is the solution execution phase, and we can see highlighted in this map of events those which include the code review cycles. And again, you can see more detail about this in Seema's methodology document. So now we're going to transition from where in the life cycle the code review actually happens to what is actually involved in the code review process. And I put up this slide to give an idea of the overview of the code review process as it exists today. Currently, we use a code review checklist developed by many. I know Felix has played a big part in pushing that to, a location where everybody can see it and honing what some of these code review checks are. But they're largely made up of a manual review process and to a very small degree, an automated code review process. And we'll see that in a history tab, which I'm just going to show in a second. But there are a few of these checks where we have automated capabilities to identify some of the issues. But I think it's important to note that there's 130 or more of these code review checks that we apply and really suggest as part of our best practice that we do for the code review process. That's a lot of checks. That's a lot of room for error, and people may be applying those checks differently, right? Because they are conceptual in nature, many of them. Again, here I've highlighted a link to the Excel spreadsheet, which represents this 130 individual checks. And I encourage you to go out there if that's a role that you have to do the code review process. I encourage you to go out there and take a look at that. Now, I wanted to take just a brief minute because we have this Excel spreadsheet, which includes some super large number of checks. And I really wanted to highlight where some of those checks really started from, or where their roots were, if any of them are automated in any fashion. And that's really what we're talking about, is being able to apply those 130 or more checks in a consistent way, in a way that makes our application better, faster, and cheaper to use. And you can read around here from left to right. I don't have to read this for you, but there's a number of performance checks that Swida has put together. There's 6 or 7 checks. They're Java-based, and you can find those in Jive as to how to download and apply those checks. And going around this chart from left to right, you can see that there's some testing tools. In a sense, that's part of the checking process to verify the code does what you expect it to do. We're talking about some repository migration stuff, some testing spreadsheets to make the testing process better and easier to use. And then some people who have honed in on a particular check, being able, like for example, to make the save history flag something that you can change for all the data methods just by using this one application. All of them an attempt to really apply and reconcile the 130 or more checks that make up our code review process. Now you'll see that there's also one here called CART, which I'm going to actually give you a demo of, one developed by me. So now we're going to drop into the third part of our discussion today. The first part, we talked about best practices, the document, and how to get and review that. The second thing we did was understand the methodology, the code review process, and where to go to get that documentation. The third, I'm going to show you an automated tool that I've developed that will hopefully be the launching point for us to develop automated code review process and get it included into the product. Let me start out by saying the name of the automated tool that I developed was called CART, Coding Automated Review Tool. The idea for it was initially given to me by Seema and Swida, who have developed, Swida in her situation, Java application, and many others we saw on the history page. Seema really came up and probably 3 or 4 weeks back said, you know, we need to be doing this code review process better, faster, more consistently, cheaper for all of us to apply. So I really jumped on that idea and developed this Windows application that I call the CART application. And so it's a tool, and it incorporates a number of those 130 checks. I think today we're up to 24 additional checks, and it's really meant to capture the logic processing of how I would actually do the check itself, how I would use the DM export file in order to drive the check and leave less up to human inspection and more up to automated review. It's a quick and easy way to do the check. If it's automated, it's an easy way for us to introduce the discussion of how a check should be performed and what a check actually is. See, so many times we have these 130 checks and they're generic in nature, right? But when doing a specific automated check, you have to be very specific. You have to drop into the very specific. I'm talking about this object. I'm talking about looking for this thing and comparing it to that thing, and the absence of which causes me to create an alert. So you get very specific very fast when you get into an implementation mode. So it's an easy way for us to now collaborate about a check, the value of it, the fact that maybe it isn't as valuable, or whatever the case may be. And it's a way for us to share the notion of it being automatable to the product team, because now we have a show and tell device, and we can show them the logic that we use to create it, And whatever the best way to implement that in our tools, we should do that. This tool that I've created, this cart tool, is not a long-term solution. It's not meant for that. It's meant as a discussion mechanism. It's meant to be a working proof of concept. It's meant to gather ideas together and share them with others in the hopes that we'll create a better product down the line with our DM tool suite. So I wanted to give you just kind of a screenshot of what the cart application looked like. I am going to drop into a demo, so I certainly am not going to explain everything here, let alone the flow of how we do it. But for the purposes of documenting what we're going to be doing in the demo, I decided to put out a number of the steps that we're going to follow, a couple of steps that we're going to talk about, and be able to give you a leave behind. So I know after you watch this, if you just wanted to take one screenshot of what the demo was all about, you could come here and take a screenshot of this. So let me drop into the demo here just one sec. So here we have the cart application once it's been opened in your Windows environment. And let me point out a couple of things here in the user interface. We have a properties file that helps us drive some of the checks. It includes some of the thresholds being used by the checks, and in an attempt to be able to not have to drop into the code in order to modify that, externalizing those variables, I've put those variables in the property file. In addition to that, what's generally needed by all the checks is the DM export file. And so we use that as a source of the truth for being able to apply the checks against something. And in some cases, we need a view of the object model, so we include that as well. There's only a few checks which apply to the object model. Most of them simply apply to the DM export file and can get their information from that. So that's really the data coming into the checking process. Once I identify those, then I can click this button called Populate Checks Below. And if you're ever confused about the process to go through, I try to put a couple of instruction steps here. And so the first thing I would do is I would identify, and let's assume for a minute that those are the proper files. And then I click the Populate Checks Below. And what that does is really fills out the array of checks that is possible. And again, like I said, there's about 24 of those here. And then I can perform the check on any one of those. I do have a couple of UI buttons to helpfully make it easier. I have an All button that will allow me to select all the checks, and a None button that will allow me to deselect all the checks. And then some information about cart. If you're ever wondering, what was done in what version, I put some information on the About button as well that will help. Now the next thing I might do is the steps say is to select the checks that we want to perform. And if you're ever confused about what a check is or what it does, I might suggest that you come in and select just single left click, and it will give you a more robust description of what that particular check is. And if you want to go to another one, you can do that as well. Right? So here's one, unused local variables, right? We talked about this one in our presentation today. We need to find out if a local variable is actually used in the logic. And so here would be a check to do exactly that. Now, let's say for a minute we want to apply all the checks. Okay, so we'll go ahead and select the All button. And then as the instruction set says, right, we've populated the files, we've populated the checks, and now we've selected the checks that we want to perform from the list above. Now we're going to perform the check button. Okay, now this may take a little time, and you'll notice the progress bar starting to go across. I may pause this recording because it sometimes can take upwards of a minute. So I'm going to click this. You're going to see the button here, and I'll hit pause. Now the reason I paused was because I'm in my development environment, and so each of the instructions are being interpreted. And so when I compile it and make this application available to each of you, you're going to run much, much faster, maybe in just a second or two. But you'll see the progress bar progress, and you'll get an idea for what the situation is. And if we go in and we look at the checks, we can see that in this particular export file, we had a check where it counted the nested ifs. And the whole idea behind that check is that if you have too many nested ifs in a row, it can degrade performance. And there's a suggestion for what to do to reorganize that logic. And in this case, I've put a threshold of 2 nested ifs. And if you exceed that count, then it draws an alert. And in this case, in a data method, right here, it found that there were 4, right? The maximum count was 2, right? That's what the threshold says. And the data method name that does that is called DMGetMailingAddress. So a technical analyst would then go in there, look at that data method, determine whether that was the optimum representation for the logic or whether there was a better way to do that. Now, in this case, there's really only 4 nested ifs as compared to 2 at a threshold. I think what we're really looking for is a huge nesting difference, right? Which would cause a degrading of performance. So while this one may have been put in just to draw attention to the check, I think that is a valuable thing to look at. And you can see that all the checks get appended to this window, and you can look and see at what all those are, right? Now, just to kind of follow up, after you perform the checks and you get all the information, you can save that to a file, right? I can click that button, and out in your environment, wherever you put your exe for this application, you're going to see that the CART-report.txt file is written, and you can rename that. If you run it today and you get a result and you want to see how that verifies against tomorrow or the next day, you can put like a date on this and do a file compare and see if in fact your check is improving, that sort of a thing. Okay, so that's the save button. The reset button allows you to basically reset this screen. So if I hit that, everything goes away, and then I can start again from new, run a new check. I can hit populate, I can do whatever, and I can perform my check. And then in just a second, it'll come down and populate here. So there you have it. That's the running of the CART application. And if you have, I may talk at some point as to how to change some of the property values and things like that. That'll be in another recording or webinar. And I really don't anticipate doing too much of that because, like I said in the beginning, this is really meant as a tool to share with the product team what the checks are that we want, how we want them to apply, and hopefully get them to include them into the product. So this is really just an intermediate step. I'm going to go back to since we've done our demo, you might ask, well, what's next? Primarily these 3 things. We want to meet with the product team to understand, just how we can include these automated checks into the DM tool suite. We feel that for all the reasons why we created external, creating it internal would be that much better, and ultimately allow us to distribute it to our customers when they take over the development process themselves. So it's kind of an extension, not just benefit to us, but benefit to our customers as well. The other is I want to meet with the other suite of products that make up originations and talk about how we might do united checking, right? Not just DM, but perhaps scenarios where a particular check crosses tool suites. Maybe it goes from DM to APM. Or maybe just APM in general. I'm not exactly sure how APM is applying all of its code checking, but perhaps we could create a united front along those lines. So that's really the second thing that we want to do. And then the third thing is to continue to build out the list of automated checks that you've seen today. Today there are 24. Whether or not there's realistically 30 or 40, there's some limited number of checks that are going to be able to be automated because of the nature of the check. And so I don't think it's reasonable that all 130 lend themselves to an automated solution. And if that number is 30 or 40 or whatever that number is, I'd like to get closer and closer to that number so that we can push the most valuable automated checks to the DM tool suite in a time frame that makes sense for us. Now, I know many of you must have questions, and in fact, I've received some questions from folks on my team And so I wanted to address what a couple of those were. And if you do have questions in addition to these, and I realize that you probably do, feel free to reach out to me anytime, and I can take it from there. But for the purposes of this discussion, questions that came in were, how many checks are automated today? Well, we talked about how there are 130 that make up the library of code review checks, right? 130 plus. And today we've automated, in my application, 24. Sweeta has another 6 or 7 in hers, so we've gone part of the way down the road, right? We've gotten literally, close to 31 or 32 checks developed, and we're probably going to continue to develop that until we get somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, and then depending on the complexity of the check, how much time it takes, all that, 80-20 value proposition will determine whether or not we go further from there. Okay, and then the next question, are there any plans to provide checks that cross OM tools? Well, like I just said on the previous slide, I think that's a grand desire, and I think it makes a lot of sense because as we understand each individual module, I think it's realistic to think that there are some crossover things that we can check as well. We'll probably be doing that as a phase 2 part of this checking, but I think that's the plan. So you might also ask, how long does it take to automate a given check in CART, right? This kind of talking proof of concept that I've created. I think it really depends. If there are similar checks that are already defined in CART, a new check can take me anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. If a check is completely new using objects that I have not included in the product, it might take me 4 hours. But I think that for the most part, once the check is understood and able to be narrated, by that I mean someone can give me some step-by-step approach as to how to identify the success or failure of a given check, then I can encode it in that tool relatively quickly, right? So we're talking anywhere from an hour to 4 hours, realistically, so somewhere in that time. So it doesn't take 100 years, and to add to the library of checks can be a very valuable thing. So there you go. Now, you might ask how you might recommend a particular check because you've seen what's been automated, you've seen what's in the list of library of checks, the 130, and you think that you have what it takes to be able to describe a particular check so that it can be applied in an automated fashion. Well, I would encourage you to do that. You can send that narration to me and we'll have a discussion, and if I understand it, then I will go ahead and implement it into the CART application. And if not, we'll have a little back and forth and discover whether it is or isn't easy to implement, and we'll kind of go from there. Now, another thing that somebody asked me was, in CART, it provides these suggestions, right? These alerts of certain conditions. And if I run the CART application, do I have to change everything in my export, in my DM, in order to make those alerts go away? And the answer is absolutely not, right? What CART is meant for is to draw your attention to potential challenges, right? In some cases, you may choose to do something which violates a best practice. If you've got a good reason for that, then go for it, right? I'm not trying to be the best practice police here, right? I'm just trying to draw attention to the fact that, are there any things that you have not seen as part of your manual inspection? That's really what it's meant to be. Now, if you have seen it, you realize it's there, and you give it your check mark to move forward with, then so be it. And so that's really the nature of this automated detection, this automated review, is not to enforce anything, but really to give you guides so that you don't have to do all of these things manually. They take a lot of time and potentially a lot of energy. And if we can get these 24 to 50 things nailed out in a matter of a minute, holy cow, that really speeds up the review process. And so I think that's the value proposition here, is we're looking for ways to do the review more consistently, to draw attention to anomalies, and to spend our time talking about those anomalies rather than the process of gathering that data. If you have any further questions about CART, about automated review, about any of those things that we've talked about today, I encourage you to reach out to me. Happy to carry on this discussion further. And I hope this was an interesting and helpful video for you to understand what we're doing in the area of best practices. Okay, have a great day.